Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. But do you remember? On the night of November 4th, 1605, a group of plotters brought 36 barrels of gunpowder into the cellar of a house in Westminster. This cellar led directly underneath Parliament. Their plan was to blow up the Parliament buildings in London with the hope of killing the king and his ministers. This was the Gunpowder Plot. The year is 1605, and yet again we find England with a little bit of religious tension in the air. England was predominantly Protestant at this time, and Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant ruler, was the previous monarch. She had some pretty severe laws against practicing Catholicism. There were fines for not attending Protestant church on Sunday, and Catholics had to practice their own faith in secret. When James I came to the throne, Catholics hoped that he would be more lenient, but he proved to be just as bad as Elizabeth. The 13 plotters involved were Catholic and wanted to protest these laws. Now, obviously, since the Parliament building is still there today, I don't think it's quite a spoiler alert to say that they failed. And thank goodness they did. They had brought enough gunpowder that if they succeeded, not only Parliament, but the whole of Westminster would have been destroyed, along with thousands of innocent lives. They left one man behind to light the fuse. This man was Guy Fawkes. On the morning of November 5th, the soldiers discovered the plot and arrested Guy Fawkes. Guy was tortured and questioned about the plot and his conspirators, and eventually he gave in. Fawkes was found guilty of high treason and executed just yards away from the Parliament buildings themselves. But how did they get caught? Well, one member, allegedly Francis Tresham, sent a letter to his relative, Lord Monteagle, who worked at Parliament, not to go to work that day. And Monteagle was suspicious, so he showed the letter around, and from there the plot unravelled. Since that day it has become yet another ceremony that the yeomen of the guard check under the cellars under the Parliament before each new session, which is a good precaution, but apparently they still do it by candle lanterns, just for prosperity, which is kind of questionable, but we do like our traditions. Now, why do we celebrate it? And what exactly are we celebrating? Well, it's an anniversary of an attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament, an attempt to kill the king, but we don't often celebrate these assassination attempts, so why this one? Well, after the execution, Guy Fawkes was predominantly thought of as the bad guy, the terrorist plotter, and people across London lit bonfires to celebrate King James's survival and the thwarting of the plot. In fact, passed just months after was the Thanksgiving Act, or the Observance of the 5th of November Act, which called for an annual Thanksgiving. It required special church services and, of course, encouraging the people to annually celebrate this failure. It was twisted into a message of the king's surviving treason attempts, with the divine intervention involved. This act was actually repealed in 1859. Now, we don't have too much information about how these early celebrations looked or how popular they were across the country, but thanks to this act, we do assume that there was some form of recognition of this date since 1605. The early celebrations themselves were tied with religion and the tensions between Catholics and Protestants at the time, but this continued on for decades later. When James II became king, who was Catholic, as we've discussed in other videos, they tried to tone down the day with a ban on bonfires and fireworks, but this was rebelled against across the country. The celebrations continued over the centuries and slowly became more of a community gathering and a festive celebration. Traditionally, this night has been celebrated with a dummy man on top of a large bonfire, which we then light on fire and have a good old celebration. That dummy, called the Guy, represents the man himself, Guy Fawkes, the man who failed to blow up Parliament. At one time in the mid-20th century, it was popular for children to build effigies and then take them door to door collecting money, or begging for a penny for the Guy. During World War I and World War II, under the Defence of the Realm Act, no one was allowed to set off fireworks or light bonfires. but people still found little ways to celebrate safely from indoors, which sounds quite familiar to us today. Now, we usually use fireworks for their celebratory purpose, but they have more of a connection specifically to bonfire night for their use of gunpowder and explosions. Created by the Chinese thousands of years ago and improved upon by the Italians, who found a way to launch them in the air and make different colours, fireworks have long been used to mark dates and celebrations. The first firework display in England was in 1486 for Henry VII's wedding to Elizabeth of York, the coming together of the houses of York and Lancaster, and the end of the War of the Roses. So it really was something to celebrate with a spectacle. Elizabeth I also loved fireworks and created the title Fire Master of England for the best firework display. After the last video on the Queen's Swans, I should probably start a list of the weirdest titles from the royal family, though I'd say that Fire Master is a little cooler than Swan Warden. Guy Fawkes himself has turned into a romanticised hero of anarchy and rebellion. His fictitious mass and media adaptations became infamous, but almost left behind his extremist and terrorist leanings. In fact, much of the British public have no idea what we celebrate or why on November 5th, and perhaps that is why it's waning in popularity in the recent decades. But even if they do know, it is kind of confusing. Why are we celebrating? As a child, I knew the story of November 5th, but it did feel a little weird to be celebrating with fireworks. Were we celebrating the plot, or ideas behind the plot, or the plot being foiled and the king being saved? But never mind, we've been doing it since 1605, so why question it now? Thanks for watching. I hope you have a wonderful 5th of November, whatever your plans may be. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.